Uh-oh. Welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind. This time, somehow, the Wheel of Jobs decided that we play Scholar, yet another healer, on a Monday evening. And this set was... well, is this some sort of bingo? Considering how strong Scholar is in this kind of content, I guess it's not too bad. That said, for duty 1, we have Bardam's Mettle, and turns out Zangetsu knew me. Hello! Bardam's Mettle, as it is, has some pretty challenging AoE pulls, with the first AoE pull being particularly difficult among them, but the second AoE pull and the second one after the first boss also stand out as reasonably tough. What makes the two first pulls especially problematic is a combination of their sizes, but also the fact that both pulls have these Haukke shoots that shoot at the tank as they pull. So when the tank reaches their endpoint, they start fighting the mobs mostly healthy. These shoots make it more likely the tank is pretty close to death. The length of the areas further emphasize this. With that said, Zangetsu was using their cooldowns very well, so the pulls getting a bit scary is more likely just because the pulls are challenging, but also because Zangetsu was legitimately at the level range for the duty and was wearing pretty much appropriate gear for the duty. So it makes sense for things to be a bit scarier. It also meant I got to use more of my toolkit, which is also a good thing. An interesting detail on the second AoE pull was that Zangetsu was layering defensive cooldowns. Rather than using a new one when the previous one ran out, instead cycled through them a few seconds before the previous one runs out. This is definitely not a bad idea, especially if you already know stretching the cooldowns out leads to you having more cooldown time than needed. Then concentrating them a bit in this way is a great idea. Furthermore, most dungeon bosses will not threaten the tank so much in the majority of the fight that you will need much more than the short cooldown that should be ready anyway. So if, for example, you have both Vengeance and Rampart available for the second AoE pull, making use of both before the boss is probably a better idea than just using one. The second pull after the first boss is a particularly good demonstration of this. As the upcoming boss involves no real fighting, you can safely use basically every cooldown you have and confidently expect them to be back before you have the opportunity to use them again. This greatly reduces the danger of this pull simply because the tank and healer both can go all out. A trick I used in this specific pull was to make use of deployment tactics to help the tank. Add Loquium on the tank, then add Loquium on myself, and when the first shield is spent on the tank, deploy from myself to give them a copy of my shield as an OGCD. If deployment tactics isn't needed for anything else, then this is a great tactic. Another small observation was that in the attempt to use everything on Zangetsu's end, they ended up with both Arm's Length and Vengeance active at the same time. The slowing effect of Arm's Length cannot activate while Vengeance is active, because for some reason you can only counter with one effect at a time, and Vengeance has a higher priority than Arm's Length. It is a really minor thing in the grand scheme of things. Finally, did you know Warrior can solo Bardam's Mettle? I mean, you have to do the dangerous pulls in smaller pieces sometimes, but the duty is soloable. Especially because Bardam adjusts the mechanics that would block you from soloing it to only require one player when you're alone. Anyway, a very good run, I would say. For duty 2, we went to Brayflox Longstop, and our tank pulled very quickly and efficiently, including pulling up near the goblin at the start so it was safer to grab the key mid-fight. On most of the big pulls, they used Rampart, with one of them using Reprisal instead. I guess they could have used both more frequently, but that's not super important. In this level range, tanks don't have that many defensive cooldowns, and even if Arm's Length is available, many players don't know that it slows the attack speed of attackers. Besides, also in this level range, if the healer casting a healing spell or two extra allows the tank to pull bigger, it will lead to better overall damage since the tank, and some DPS, can make up the difference lost by the healer with AoE. Overall, a very nice and quick Brayflox run with a solid team. For duty 3, we went to Stone Vigil. I got the impression that our paladin might have been here for the first time. They were playing very carefully, single pulling throughout the entire duty. They were also using defensive cooldowns every so often, so I think they were still practicing these kinds of things, which is great. I think the Bard might have been a newer player, but I did see they had level 70 gear, so maybe they weren't as new as expected. The monk, a few times in the duty, did the classic of starting on running ahead expecting the big pull and then coming back immediately. I've done this sometimes too. Throughout the duty, no one but the tank pulled, and we took it slow and steady. On the first boss, our Bard got hit by both Swinge and Lion's Breath, and I didn't expect this, so I couldn't manage to resolve it fast enough. What I could have done would be to use a Shuna immediately and then heal them. On the final boss, the Bard also got hit by the Frost Breath, but only once. They learned from the experience, which is a good thing. Speaking of the Frost Breath, did you know that the tank can dodge it? If you stand all the way up close to the center of the dragon, when the animation for the breath begins, stepping through the dragon allows you to step out of the way before the snapshot. Very handy for soloing the dungeon as, say, a warrior. For duty 4, we went to Cutter's Cry, a super weird duty. If you pull as big as you can, there are really only 2 pulls that warrant using defensive cooldowns at all. Obviously, all the pulls benefit from using defensive cooldowns. But the pull before the first boss and the large hallway after the second boss are the 2 key points. Our tank did use defensives heavily on that last pull, but not much aside from that throughout the duty. Given their equipment, I'm guessing they were still learning the job, and besides, we were not in any danger. The entire party also knew about the skip before the second boss, so we easily zipped through that section with no issues. Each of the bosses have some weird details about them that you can play around. The first boss has a silence you can interrupt, but it will face the person it is planning to target, so if it is aiming the silence at someone who isn't going to be using spells anyway, you can just ignore it. By doing so, you also are more likely to have it interrupt when it tries to cast haste on the ad. If you're here as a caster of some sort, bringing echo drops can also help you out in case you do end up silenced anyway. The second boss will sometimes apply sludge to a party member, which does a bit of damage initially and applies a removable dot that does a lot of damage over its duration. This dot is strong enough that Ishuna might be worth casting. Alternatively, if the initial attack does not do any damage due to a barrier, then the dot is not applied. So, as a barrier healer, maintaining barriers on everyone might actually be worth the trouble. The final boss, the notorious Chimera, uses Ram's voice and Dragon's voice, and your initial warning sign is the boss announcing either that its eyes glow purple or blue. Blue for Ram, purple for Dragon. Ram's voice requires you to run away, while Dragon's voice requires you to come in close. This is the easy part. It starts to get harder once the boss starts to use other mechanics, namely Cacophony can be difficult to dodge without losing uptime as a melee, and if the Chimera chooses to use Dragon's voice while you're still out there baiting the orb, you might not make it in time. Ram's Keeper can also block your intended escape route for Ram's voice or block off the safe space for Dragon's voice. That said, we had a very easy run through here. For duty 5, we went to Ihuykatumu, and this was a pretty normal run, aside from a weird spot after the first boss where we ended up doing some of the pulls one by one. This was mostly weird because all the other pulls in the duty were done as wall-to-wall pulls. An interesting challenge with actively trying to align raid buffs is that all it takes is one of the players choosing to delay, and then it can be nearly impossible to get back in sync without communication. Obviously, it is entirely unnecessary to do in a dungeon, but it can be fun to challenge yourself to do while in a duty. The particular exception to this is that if you're trying to align with a dancer, you just need to keep an eye on the technical step buff they get when they prepare technical finish, and be ready to set up yours as technical finish comes out. On the final boss especially, I tried hard to make extensive use of micromanaging my pet, making more use of Fey Blessing and Whispering Dawn, which is something I could certainly do more. But also repositioning it so that I get the most value out of these cooldowns without worrying about where I am when they're cast. Let's just say this duty was so relaxed I had plenty of space to experiment, and also made extensive use of dissipation. For duty 6, we went to Aitiascope. Overall, we had no major issues throughout the duty, although on the first boss, the Dragoon got swiped by messing up the returning line AoEs a second time. This could happen to anyone. I sometimes make that mistake too. In fact, the boss tends to set up this mechanic and then follow it up with a mechanic that may require you to reposition, which easily can trick you into forgetting about the returning lines. Aside from this, throughout the duty, it seemed like our warrior initially would a bit randomly choose between using single target and AoE on AoE pulls. And at other times it also felt like usage of Bloodwetting was inconsistent. Besides this, the duty went just fine, of course. A general tip I would like to give learning tanks, and learning healers for that matter, is that being consistent helps you to be predictable, and being predictable leads to easier teamwork. For duty 7, we went to Vanaspati, which is known to have some pretty tough initial pulls, especially the second AoE pull. This is because 2 of the mobs in the pull are both the biggest mobs in the pack, doing the most damage, and also being ranged. So while normally the tank relies on effectively kiting the mobs while running them up, these mobs being fully ranged means the tank ends up taking a ton of damage leading up to reaching their destination. Normally, the length from the first pack to the second is a minor detail, but carrying the pull all the way to the wall can be scary for some healers. Both Sage and Astrologian can spam healing spells while running one way or another if needed. This is less of an option for White Mage and Scholar, who both can run out. This didn't really turn into a problem here, but I had to follow the tank down the hall just long enough to realize this could become a problem. While I still have to follow along, I can't really use Ether Pact, assuming I had Fairy Gauge. I can't really put down Sacred Soil, and once Swift Cast is spent, Adloquim can also end up cut off. This is part of the reason why pulls with ranged mobs can be scary. That said, over the course of the duty, I focused more on making sure I didn't waste too much of the Fairy Gauge by leaving it at full, whether it was by putting it on the tank instead of using something else, or by using it to top up a DPS after mechanic. A nice solid run. For duty 8, we went to Worqor Zormor with another solid group. In this duty, I also made extensive use of Ether Pact, ironically to such a degree that several times in the duty I had trouble using Whispering Dawn and Summon Seraph on AoE pulls, because I was busy using Ether Pact. This is of course a sign that I had exaggerated my focus on Ether Pact instead of balancing my toolkit. Despite this, the run went very smoothly. For duty 9, we went to Tam-Tara Deepcroft. The tank seemed maybe a bit new, while simultaneously possibly well versed with similar games. They were pulling big, yet carefully, while not using that many defensive cooldowns, and not using sprint very much. They were also carefully making sure all mobs went to them if they missed any. I think this is extremely well done, especially as a Sprout. This led to a nice and quick run overall. As a Scholar, the best you can do here is try to apply Bio to each enemy that you expect to live at least around 24 seconds, because Bio 1 kind of sucks. Finally, for duty 10, we went to Haukke Manor, and the tank immediately admitted it had been a while since they did this dungeon, and they were also legitimately a level 30 Dark Knight, so new to the job. Both themselves and the Reaper were also returning players. I noticed on a few occasions the Reaper made use of their stuns to interrupt boss mechanics. Excellent. Because the tank stated it had been a while since they did the dungeon, I used markers to guide the team through the duty, and in some places we went a bit slower than normal, which makes sense, and it's totally fine. We also ended up with a lot more keys than we needed, which is also pretty normal for Haukke Manor, and pretty funny in retrospect. Another pretty funny thing about the cellar section of the dungeon is that because you can run around the place in a circle, you can effectively pull everything, probably even as a solo player, and just run away from the mobs whenever you need some breathing room. As I was doing this set, I was getting more and more surprised I kept getting leveling dungeons. Even if they're super common for healers, 10 in a row seems a bit lucky. Or unlucky depending on your preference. Additionally, the reason I was surprised to get a healer again out of the job roulette is that the chance of a healer at this point was 2 out of 15, about 13% chance. At this point, the probability of each roll is about 14% for a tank, 7% for a healer, and 79% for DPS. So there's that. I'm also glad we had a few duties with what seemed to be learning tanks, because that makes the duties a bit more interesting for me, but also hopefully helped them a bit with practicing. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Shadowbringers, the ability Bane, which spreads a weaker version of your dots to nearby targets, was available to both Scholar and Summoner. Bane was learned at level 30, so this effectively meant Scholar had access to AoE damage options already by level 30.